All right, I'm going to count down now from 37. No, from 5, and then we'll start. Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanning here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zender. Today, we discuss ethical concerns about the new COVID-19 vaccines. We welcome 2 special guests. Stacy Trasancos, Ph.D., is the Executive Director of St. Philip Institute in Tyler, Texas. Melissa Moschella is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Catholic University of America. She's also visiting scholar at the Heritage Foundation's Simon Center for American Studies. Both have recently written on ethics and the new vaccines. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Let's begin today and continue for a while looking at a number of points made in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith statement issued some months ago. I'd like each of you to comment on these statements, and you could do so alternatively, or is it alternately? I believe alternately would be more precise. In fact, on a student paper, I might underline that. Alternatively, I could cut short this introduction. And so we begin with the first statement. In cases, and this is from the CDF document, in cases where cells from aborted fetuses are employed to create cell lines for use in scientific research, there exist differing degrees of responsibility, of cooperation and evil. So we have the evil acknowledged, but there are different degrees of responsibility. Stacy, would you like to say something on that?
Sure. The first time I encountered this language, I remember it resonated with me right away because I knew that my degree of responsibility was not the same as the scientist who wrote the experiments that called for aborted fetal tissues. Or the doctors who performed the abortion. So I got that right away, and it was somewhat of a relief to know that that differing level of responsibility was acknowledged, but it still left some, and I think that's kind of where we are right now today, which is why I'm saying it. I still think it needs further examination about what are our responsibilities today as end users of these vaccines or any other medical development that's done using the bodies of aborted children. So there are different degrees of responsibility, and we talk to a lot of my husband and I have recently assumed leadership of Children of God for Life, and we've been talking to a lot of people who are making the decisions about whether to use the vaccine or not. And the way we say it to them is, it's not your fault that you're in this position today where you have no other alternative and you're just trying to keep yourself, your family, and your community safe. It's not your fault, but we're very much also, and I hope that's one of the fruits of this conversation, we're looking forward about what do we do, because we can't put a fence around our moment in time right now and say we have no responsibility, that we're indifferent to what goes on from now on, because if we're going to have an effective voice in shutting, and ending the use of aborted children in research, then we got to think about what that means when we say that we're fine with benefiting from the things that are discovered using aborted children.
Thank you. Melissa, your comments, please.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand. So that statement that you read, quoting from the CDF note on the use of the vaccines, it comes from an earlier document called Dignitas Personae. And that document was animated primarily by a number of concerns related to kind of beginning of life issues, including research ethics issues. And in particular, what they were worried about in terms of research ethics was the use of the creation and destruction of human embryos for research, and the creation of human embryonic cell lines for stem cell research, which was kind of huge at the time and hugely debated at the time when that document was released, as well as the practice of direct use of aborted fetal tissue in research. And what I think is important to note is that both of those practices, the creation and destruction of human embryos and the direct use of aborted fetal tissue in research, is that those are practices that perpetuate, that create a demand for more tissue, for more embryos, right? To create for research and then destroy, for more fetal tissue to do more of the research. And that those are the main practices that are the kind of focus of that document. Those are the practices that are mentioned explicitly in the course of the ethical analysis. And then at the end, they kind of tag on this stuff about vaccines and cell lines made originally from the tissue of aborted fetuses. But what I think is ambiguous about that is that there's a very important difference between the practices that are really animating the document, the use of creation and destruction of human embryos and the direct use of aborted fetal tissue. There's a big difference between that and the use of a cell line, which was created many years ago from an aborted fetus, but which now does not perpetuate the practice of abortion or require new tissue from aborted fetuses or from embryos. So I think those practices are very different, and very different in terms of the kind of cooperation and evil that might be involved, precisely because if you use a cell line like HEK 293, which is primarily the one that we're concerned about in terms of the COVID vaccines, that cell line was created over 50 years ago, or about 50 years ago, from thought to be an aborted fetus. We actually aren't quite sure of the origin, but it seems likely that it was an aborted fetus. But no more abortions have had to take place. So using more of that cell line does not create demand for more abortions. There was that one abortion, then the cells were modified to enable them to become what you call an immortal cell line that basically reproduces itself indefinitely. And what is being used now in labs is something that's, biologically modified countless generations separate from that original aborted fetal tissue. And using more of that cell line doesn't in any way create more demand for fetal tissue. Actually, on the contrary, because of the way these cell lines work, scientists want to use established cell lines that have well-known properties. It actually, in a sense, reduces the demand to get more fetal tissue and create new cell lines from fetal tissue. So you have a very different situation with the use of these cell lines that I think makes the level of connection to the evil so much less than the level of connection that you find in embryo destructive research or research directly on aborted fetal tissue.
So there's a big distinction then between what's going on with the vaccines and what, say, David Daleiden and friends are doing. Because
exactly.
What they're doing is burrowing into Planned Parenthood and Planned Parenthood's ongoing abortions which are continuously used to supply research centers. Right.
That's right. So that's really, I think, the evil that's being perpetuated in research practices that we need to focus on fighting against, because that is in fact creating more demand for new fetal tissue, incentivizing the abortion industry, illegally paying money for fetal body parts, though it's routinely done, as we saw in those videos. But those are the practices that really we need to focus on stopping, whereas the use of these cell lines does not in any way perpetuate the grave injustice of abortion.
Yeah.
One last thought, and then I want to ask Mario to join us, and then Christopher. Might not the very researchers that are being supplied now by Planned Parenthood take their work to be validated by the now widespread acceptance of, say, the vaccines? They might say, yes, look what we're doing, but this is what was done, and look how much we benefited from it. So why not continue in the same line?
Could I interject something very quickly? In Dignitas Personae, it is specifically talking about cell lines. When they use that language about differing degrees of responsibility, I just want to correct that. They were in that whole section specifically talking about cell lines. It starts out for scientific research and the production of vaccines or other products, cell lines are at times used. And so they were making a connection between our acceptance of cell lines from aborted fetuses and the connection between our obligation today to say no to these practices, to mobilize our consciences in favor of life. So they are dealing with the cell lines in that document.
Right, that specific line was, but the larger moral analysis is centered on these other practices of embryo destructive research and so on.
You're going to lead us to go back and look at that document too. Every time we have a discussion, we have more work to do. Mario.
Well, I have an observation and then a question. If those lines of from which we get the vaccine were compromised, but we still are cooperating with them, even remotely and passively, is there any claim that argue that evil have a statute of limitation? What I'm saying is that I'm coming from a country where there was an oppressive regime for many, many years that used practices that are really horrible from human rights perspective. And yet at one point when that regime was deposed, there was a compromise. And the compromise was such that the country would continue building its democracy without putting into trial the people who violate human rights in order to have a peaceful transition. Yet today, many of these people who commit crimes still alive and enjoy the benefit of that democratic regime. So some people say today, well, the reason why we are not really having a full democracy because at one point we didn't just put a limit on that evil committed and put to trial to these people. Perhaps the analogy is not very fair because I'm bringing from political philosophy, if you will, to biology. But I wonder if, is that what we are doing here by claiming that, yes, we are not cooperating directly or even remotely, but I'm wondering about the evil committee have a limit in time.
I think what you bring up is a really interesting point, which is that we live in a fallen world, a sinful world, where it is literally impossible to insulate oneself from the effects of past injustices, and actually literally impossible often to benefit from past injustices. So think, for instance, about, horrific research practices that Nazi experimenters used, experimenting on concentration camp inmates or people in mental institutions. We got the drug chloroquine, an anti-malaria drug, from those experiments. Those were grossly immoral and unjust. But does that mean that in order to distance ourselves from that evil, we have to now pretend that those experiments never happened, redo them in order to get the information again in a morally legitimate way? What about slave labor that was used to build so much of our economic infrastructure, to build many of the railroads across the United States? What about unjust wars that were used to, wipe out Native Americans and steal their land, and now we're profiting from that? Or, most of the borders and land that many countries are enjoying are the result of historic evils and injustices. It's just so complex that it's impossible to isolate yourself from the benefits of evil. So then the question is, okay, what are the moral dangers here, and how can I avoid them? And I think one key thing to consider is, well, am I in any way perpetuating that evil by now enjoying its benefits, right? And you could say it was, say, the Nazi research case. Well, clearly not, right? If I take the drug chloroquine, I'm in no way perpetuating the evil of those unjust experiments. Am I in any way implying a kind of approval of those practices? And again, I think you could safely say, no, I could take chloroquine or use the information that was gained from those experiments without approving, right? While at the same time saying, well, that was terrible, but okay, but now we have this helpful information. And then there's also the question of the corruption to your own character, which is a potential danger, right? Where moral theologians and philosophers talk about this danger as the danger of seepage, right? That the evil intent of the original actors could seep into your own will because you're benefiting from their evil actions. So the question is, well, is that kind of gross lack of concern for the dignity of the research subjects of the Nazi experimenters, is that going to kind of seep into my own will? Am I going to, even subconsciously begin to think that it's not quite as bad because I am routinely benefiting from its effects? And that's always a danger, right? That could be a danger in terms of slave labor. That could be a danger in terms of unjust wars, where you say, well, maybe it wasn't so bad because good things came of it, right? And that's where I think one needs to just make the internal effort to distance oneself, right? And I think here what we come at, and this is I think the key in terms of what's going on with the kind of moral analysis that the CDF is doing is to remember the basic principle, which is that evil is in the will, right? Or as Jesus says, right, evil is in the heart, right? So it's to the extent that we latch on to, share the evil intentions of the evildoer in any way, that we are doing something wrong by enjoying the benefits of those historic evils.
Christopher.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. But is it true that, obviously when you talk about evil being in the will, you're talking about moral evil. You're not talking about physical evil.
Of course, yes.
Tornadoes are physical evils, and they're certainly not in the will. But isn't it the case, this is a strange example, I think, but a large bowl of cocaine. I've heard of some of these cast parties in Los Angeles where, Jim lives, they have these bowls of cocaine. Now, a bowl of cocaine is not in itself morally evil because it can't be capable of moral action. But yet, is it not the case that it's evil for us because you might say that the fact the bowl of cocaine is there arose from moral act. it also tends to, it's there for the commission of more immoral acts. Nuclear weaponry, for instance. Nuclear weapons, are they in themselves evil? Not morally speaking, no. One might even perceive the use of a nuclear weapon like knocking a meteorite out of the sky, if that were even possible. But yet, we would still say they're evil. And to a certain extent, in a sense, morally evil because of what they come, because they arise from a moral evil, an immoral decision, and they have a tendency to induce us to maybe at times use that instrument for immoral ends. So I don't know if you can just separate out the things which are not human and say that there are no way moral evils.
Well, so there obviously we could speak analogously about things as evil, but that, I mean, just like all analogies, right? It still is analogously evil by in some way being connected with an evil intent. So cocaine or, nuclear weaponry could be called evil insofar as their intended use is evil. Or you could say the same thing about, say, tools made explicitly for burglary or robbery, right? They're evil insofar as their intended use is evil. But I don't think you can say the same thing about cell lines. The intended use of those cell lines is not evil. It's good, in fact. The problem is that the origin, that the material that was used to make the cell lines was derived in an unjust manner, right? But it's very complicated, right? And I think one example that helps to highlight the complexity is to think, so imagine that there's a child who needs a heart transplant, and then a heart becomes available because a baby was murdered, say by her abusive father. Is it wrong to use that heart for transplantation? Even though obviously the heart became available because of a terrible evil, right? The murder of a baby by her father. But provided that, consent was obtained from, say, the mother or somebody not an accessory to the murder, there's nothing wrong with using that heart to save somebody else's life.
Can we take that analogy? I mean, if we're looking for realistic analogies that fit the situation that we're in right now, not with just fetal cell lines, but with fetal tissue research in general, which is a big thing right today. There are more research programs using the remains of aborted children now than ever before, and they're growing. So we do have to think about what our choices how they influence the sin in others today. The more relevant analogy here to build on the 2-year-old child, with slave labor, slavery ended. Okay, there was a war fought, hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives to end that injustice. So we don't live in a world where there are still slaves building railroads. We do live in a world today where abortion is legal and pervasive. And so the more relevant analogy would be if we lived in a country where it was legal to abort your 2-year-old child, okay? Because murder is illegal as well. So that's not a good analogy. If we lived in a country where it was legal for a mom who got tired of dealing with her 2-year-old throwing tantrums to go down to the abortion clinic and say, I want to abort this child because I don't want to raise it anymore. I don't want this child anymore. If that were legal, and then on the other side of the abortion room, there were scientists waiting to dissect that child once she's dead and use her organs in research. And those scientists were saying, we're bringing all these medical benefits for the rest of you people to find cures and make your lives better. If we were living in that situation, because that is the situation with abortion that we're in right now, would it be responsible of us to say, we're okay, we find it moral to accept the benefit of the research using those 2-year-old children, but we also want you to stop killing them? So we are setting up a contradiction.
Well, I think you're right about that when it comes to the direct use of fetal tissue in research. And I am absolutely in agreement that that needs to be fought. I mean, obviously, the problem is not the use of fetal tissue, but the use of aborted fetal tissue. Right. There could be ethically acceptable ways to get fetal tissue. You could get fetal tissue for research from, say, spontaneous miscarriages or
it just
preterm
doesn't
births.
Work as well. They won't do it because the tissues are decomposing already. No.
I mean, I've spoken with researchers about this. It could be done. It's simply that there isn't the will to do it. You'd have to, there's now a whole system set up with arrangements from abortion clinics to get the tissue, but you could get the tissue that's needed for experiments with fetal tissue from these ethical sources if there was a will to do it and make correct arrangements with hospitals and so on from situations, again, of spontaneous miscarriage and non-viable preterm
but usually
births.
Those children die before they leave the body. That's the difference. They're long dead before they leave. So
yes, I mean, I think the point here is not to sort of go back on the science. I'm taking this from a neurobiologist who has studied this in detail, who has actually put forward proposals for ethical attainment of fetal tissue, and there just hasn't been political will. But the problem isn't that it's impossible. But anyway, we're in agreement that that direct use of fetal tissue for research and the way it's currently done is absolutely wrong, and we should fight against that and look for alternatives. My point is that the use of a cell line like HEK293 created 50 years ago from aborted fetal tissue does not have the problems that you're talking about with direct use of aborted fetal tissue, because the cell line doesn't require new fetal tissue.
Let me interject here. We've had a very good discussion of one sentence of the CDF document. So I'm going to collect B and C on the teacher's outline. And since C assumes B, and I'm going to give another, not just one sentence, but this is approaching a paragraph. All right, quote, the fundamental reason for considering the use of these vaccines morally illicit is that the kind of cooperation in evil, passive material cooperation, in the procured abortion from which these cell lines originate is, on the part of those making use of the vaccines, remote. The moral duty to avoid such passive material cooperation is not obligatory if there is a grave danger, such as the otherwise uncontainable spread of a serious pathological agent. In this case, the pandemic spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. Stacy, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. So I think we're coming at this from two different ways. On the one hand, if I'm hearing it correctly, there's no cooperation in evil, and that is not what I mean. If we say there is no cooperation in evil, that's false. That's not what the document says. It's not what the Vatican has advised. As a mother who's vaccinated children using vaccines derived from aborted fetal cell lines back since 2003, I've long been thinking about this. And I never took what the CDF or the Pontifical Academy for Life ever said as saying that we have no cooperation in evil. We have a passive material remote cooperation, which means it's still cooperation. It's just morally illicit if you're in an extraordinary situation where you're trying to protect your children or yourself. So I think what's getting lost here in the two ways we're coming at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, we still have a duty to say it's not okay to use vaccines created with these cell lines, the same way we have a duty to say it's not okay to use aborted children in research. It's consistent. So The moral duty to avoid such passive material cooperation is not obligatory if there's a grave danger. If there's not a grave danger, there is still a moral duty to avoid the material cooperation. So I want to emphasize that, because I'm very much, I know we're here today and it's not all our fault, but we do have an obligation going forward in how we're going to fight this. And I don't see how we're going to say, we're fine with benefiting from aborted children in research, even if it's a fetal cell line, we're fine with benefiting from it, but you better stop doing it. Because I worked in the industry for DuPont, not a pharmaceutical, but I know how they think on the other side of the table. And if you say, if they already know you're going to say it's moral to benefit from the research, you have you've just conceded your ground to them when you say you shouldn't do this research. So, I mean, that may not be what we mean to say. We may be trying to say, well, I'm going to benefit from the vaccine, but I want you to stop doing that kind of research. We may think we're saying that. We may think we're not influencing it, but I'm telling you from the other side of the table, it will be perceived as saying, we don't care. We'll hold our nose. You do the research you're going to do. And when you come up with new cures, we're going to find it okay to use those cures, and we'll look the other way. And that is the thing that we need to be talking about how we're going to have this conversation.
Let me read the next segment here, and Melissa can lead our discussion on the next segment. Again, from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The illicit use of such vaccines does not and should not in any way imply that there is a moral endorsement of the use of cell lines proceeding from aborted fetuses. Both pharmaceutical companies and government health agencies are therefore encouraged to produce, approve, distribute, and offer ethically acceptable vaccines that do not create problems of conscience for either healthcare providers or the people to be vaccinated. Melissa?
Yeah, so I think what we should do is kind of clarify some of this terminology about cooperation and what it means. So, I mean, I'm not saying that there's no cooperation. So, I mean, there's a kind of technical distinction here between cooperation and evil narrowly defined, which means actually contributing to a present or future evil. Right. I mean, that's the term cooperation actually suggests that, right? I cooperate with evil. A kind of classic case would be, you know, a nurse working in a secular hospital that provides abortions, right? Insofar as even if she's not working in any way related to what's going on with abortions, she's supporting that hospital by working there, and so there's a cooperation remote in abortion, which is acceptable. Acceptable because of the good that she does by serving her patients and being a witness in that arena, and so on and so forth, right? That's a kind of classic idea of cooperation, or, you know, the daily cooperation in evil that we're all engaged in just simply by participating in the economy. You know, there's hundreds of companies that either directly or indirectly contribute to Planned Parenthood, for instance, and having our retirement funds in, you know, index funds, for instance, is contributing indirectly to Planned Parenthood. Paying our taxes is contributing indirectly to abortions and other sorts of things. Buying Energizer batteries and Nike shoes and banking with Chase, right? All of these things are actually actively cooperating with abortion very remotely, and therefore, I believe, permissibly. But I think the point is that and this is what the point I was making earlier, in a fallen world like ours, and with, you know, sinful structures all around us, cooperation with evil is inevitable. We simply cannot avoid it. And so then the question is, well, when is it permissible? And I think, as the CDF says, in a case like this, it is permissible. And in this case, you know, they use the term passive cooperation, which is sort of odd because, you know, it's a past evil, right? So we can't change that can't change what happened in the past. And so, some theologians and moral philosophers have suggested that a better terminology there is appropriation of the fruits of evil, or enjoying the benefits of evil. But it's the same idea. The same basic idea is that we should avoid any kind of formal cooperation or any kind of ratification of the past evil, which means that your will is somehow in alignment with the evil will. That's the thing that always has to be avoided. And then that we need to avoid other dangers like scandal or corruption of character that I mentioned earlier that could result from benefiting from or in some way contributing to these evil practices. And so, so my point is that the distance, morally speaking, from the evil of abortion, when you're dealing with a vaccine that was made with the help of an abortion-derived cell line, is enormous, much greater and different in kind from the kind of distance that happens with the use of new fetal tissue. Again, because there's no perpetuation of the injustice. So that, the fact that Pfizer and Moderna used HEK 293 for confirmatory lab tests for their vaccines, their use of that cell line did not in any way promote a new abortion. Right? That cell line exists in part because an abortion happened 50 years ago. But the fact that we're using that cell line today does not make it any more likely that additional abortions will happen today or tomorrow or in the future. And so that's where I think the difference comes in. Now, would it be better to have cell lines that had no connection to abortion? Of course. The problem is that, in terms of the way the scientific research works, I absolutely agree that we should be, as I've been saying, we should be lobbying for an end to the practice of making new cell lines from aborted fetuses, using new aborted fetal tissue, also using human embryos in research and so on. But with the existing cell lines, even if all of that stopped today, which I'll hope and pray that it will stop at some point in the future, the new ethically derived cell lines will not be able to replace the historic ones that exist. Because, as I said before, of the way that science works, such that there is such a kind of knowledge of the way that HEK 293 functions and its properties, that a new cell line simply will not be able it simply will not have the scientific usefulness or anywhere close to one that is well researched and well known in the scientific community. And so, should we lobby for it to cease being used entirely? I'm not sure that we should. Just like I don't think we should lobby for the end of the use of chloroquine or some of the other things that we've learned from Nazi experiments.
Stacy, your take on this section.
Yeah, I mean, I hear the statement being said that if we approve of the use of HEK 293, or in the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's PERC 6C6, which is from an 18-week-old aborted child. If we know there are more fetal cell lines being developed today, if we know that today there is an entire fetal human cell atlas being developed with single cell transcriptomics that can tell the genome of cell by cell of the development of a human being from the zygote to birth, if we know all of these research programs are underway, how can you just say that our acceptance of the use of HEK 293 doesn't in any way say that we support the other? Like, how can you say it doesn't lend any support to that? Because I hear it being said, I just don't know what the reasoning is there.
Well, I think one thing that's really important to recognize is that the new fetal cell lines being made are not being made to replace HEK 293. They're being made for distinct scientific purposes, right? I mean, different cell lines have different advantages in terms of the way that they work. They're more or less useful for different research questions. So it's not that researchers are saying, oh, we're using too much of HEK 293, we're running out of it. We need to start creating more fetal cell lines. That would be
It's not like
perpetuation.
No.
It's not like that.
No, I agree. But what they are saying is there's a use for these, and they're not immortal in the sense that they don't ever run out. They do at some point stop reproducing, and they do at some point need other fetal cell lines. My take on all of this is that we're putting a fence around just HEK 293 when we need to be looking at the bigger picture and how our acceptance, if we were to say, you know what, it's fine, just use HEK 293, we have no qualms about it at all. I'm concerned that if we as a church said that, then we have no legitimacy. We would be contradicting ourselves when we say, but don't use aborted children in research anymore. Because I know the research is going on, and to say it's okay on one hand, but not okay on the other hand, I'm very, I don't want to argue about it. I want to know how we move forward from here. If we adopt that view that it's just fine to use HEK 293, no problem there, but we do have a problem here. Like, I don't know how we're going to make that case.
Again, I don't want to just say it's just fine. I think the key thing is that there is proportionate reason to use it. And, so again, we're working, just like I think there could be a proportionate reason to bank with Chase, even though they are using some of their profits to donate to Planned Parenthood, because I think that the cooperation there is so remote, and there are benefits to be gained. So there's proportionate reason. I think there's even greater proportionate reason to use a cell line like this that has enormous scientific benefits.
We on the Open Door take the view that disputed questions should be robustly disputed. And so I'm going to ask Mario to continue the discussion.
Well, I have been following carefully the discussion, very interesting. But this is what comes to my mind. Do you think, a couple of things, do you think the faithful, regular believer Catholic really is grasping this fine distinction we are making? For instance, in the statement that Jim just read, there is a line which says the licit use of such vaccine doesn't and should not in any way imply there is a moral endorsement. So if I ask someone who is a Catholic in the pew who doesn't know much about bioethics, for him probably will say, well, the use is licit, but I really don't endorse morally. Wouldn't that statement be a little bit contradictory? That's any of you, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's why it's important to educate people. The bishops, have also issued a statement that attempts to explain these things. I think the people can understand these things if they're explained. And I don't think it's any more difficult than explaining, why it's okay to buy Energizer batteries or have a certain retirement plan, even though these companies give to Planned Parenthood. We're not saying that we agree with the things that they're promoting, but we're just saying that I'm not contributing to that evil. I'm not endorsing that evil by contributing to these companies.
But I'll benefit from it.
Let me get Christopher in here because some of his best friends are Amish.
I do have an Amish friend, yeah, but sort of. Anyway.
It could lead to more, Christopher.
Yeah, you never know. Yeah, but I guess the question, I think this might have been touched on before. I think we're all agreed that there is illicit use of vaccines derived from this cell line. Nevertheless, isn't it the case when we're talking about the people who develop these cell lines and who will develop cell lines in the future, aren't they simply going to say, well, these people, they protest against this, but when push comes to shove, they'll use it.
They'll take it.
And that is a much more powerful message than anything we say. I think that's why here in the CDF document, they say that you only should do this if there's a grave danger. Now, granted, there's a big difference. I think there is you have the problem of railroads developed by slaves or drugs developed from Nazi experimentation. All those are there, lands taken from the American Indians. But again, it's the proximate danger that we face now. Right now, maybe we don't face slave labor, unless you consider wage slaves. That's what we do face right now is the development of more of these cell lines. And so the message has to be more than just by mouth. It has to be also by action, doesn't it? By what we do and what we don't do.
Well, I think, again, there are ways to give the message, like, unfortunately, this will be rescinded, of course, with the new administration that's just about to come in. But, under President Trump, there was a change in funding guidelines to not give any funding to research that uses new aborted fetal tissue, right, including research to derive cell lines. I mean, those sorts of policies would be the sorts of policies that we can fight for to stop this injustice from happening. I mean, I think one thing to think about is the most commonly used cell line. HEK 293 is the second most commonly used cell line. The most commonly used cell line is the Gila cell line, named for Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman whose tissue was taken from her cancerous uterus without her knowledge or consent to create the first immortal cell line. And again, because it was the first, and for the reasons that I mentioned before about the particular value of kind of known cell lines that have known properties and are widely used and widely cited, and so researchers understand how they work. That became sort of the bread and butter of basic science research. And it's interesting, how Johns Hopkins has dealt with the fact that, as we have become more sensitized to the importance of consent in using fetal tissue or using human tissue for research, and the fact that there was no consent in this case, that they have taken a number of steps to try to first, honor Henrietta Lacks for her contribution. They have taken, family members from, descendants of Henrietta Lacks and sort of explain what was going on. They've put them sort of on the board. I don't know if they're now getting some kind of compensation for the use of the cell lines. And so, there's a kind of testimony to the fact that, now they have pledged themselves to better research practices and so on. I think that's what we want to work toward in terms of research that involves fetal tissue. We want to work towards something where we, first of all, change the dynamics so that abortion is no longer legal. We want to change the dynamics so that the use of tissue from aborted fetuses is no longer the kind of go-to source of such tissue. And so we want to change the dynamic in the same way that the dynamic has been changed in terms of other research practices. And that's going to take time, right? There are lots of structural injustices here that need to be overcome before, the use of something like HEK 293 can be fully analogous to something like the use of Gila or the use of Nazi research science, because the injustice of abortion is behind us. And so I agree, Stacy, with you that there's a difference here, that the injustice of abortion remains, it isn't behind us. And so none of these other cases are entirely analogous. But that's why I think that what we need to focus our energies on in the pro-life community is putting that injustice behind us. And that something like, fighting the use of HEK 293 or vaccines derived from it isn't going to help. In fact, might actually do harm to the pro-life movement, insofar as people are connecting the pro-life movement with a movement against taking a vaccine that is going to be so enormously beneficial for society in terms of helping us to recover from this terrible pandemic.
Let me get a little pushy here because we're down to our last 10 minutes. This happens every single show. We've been distinguishing and trying to make some careful distinctions and wondering whether the carefully made distinctions are recognized. And it seems to me that we're involved in something that Pope Francis is very wary of, casuistry. And yet, Pope Francis, with prophetic witness, did not choose to take a nuanced approach towards the possession of nuclear weapons, which in the past has been done, but he flatly rejects their possession. So on the one hand, we have this urge to cut it with the casuistry. And on the other hand, we have this commission to speak prophetically. And are we going to get this balance right all the time down through the centuries of the church's life? I don't think so. I don't think so. And so it seems at the very least here in the present context, we have those who would like to take a witness and say, yes, I suppose others aren't going to see this the way I do, and I can, to some extent, share their reasoning. But, well, we have somebody like Dorothy Day. There's a reason for practicing proper responses to a threat of nuclear war, and I can understand why people built bomb shelters. But when this drill comes about, this next drill, I'm not going in any bomb shelter. I'm going to go out in public and make a witness. That too is part of the life of the church. And can we recognize people who want to make a witness against abortion, given its heinous and omnipresent existence, and say, not for now. You folks come up with a better vaccine in terms of its antecedents, and then I'll join you.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, we've been dealing with this. I mean, part of the reason, so when COVID-19 came about and we realized there was going to be a vaccine, I started making noise about it then. This is a chance to demand an ethically produced vaccine, because 15 years ago, it was the same story. And I've seen personally, just to get beyond the moral calculus, to put some real life into it, I've seen personally how ineffective it is to say, on one hand, please vaccinate my child with this vaccine. But on the other hand, I want you to stop producing and using and buying and making available these vaccines. I said that a bunch of times, and the church told us we were supposed to end this practice. And I haven't seen anything be effective with that approach. And I would hope going forward, we could take another approach, because I don't know how to draw a line between an abortion that happened yesterday and a dead body of a child on a lab bench somewhere being dissected for its organs. I don't know how to draw a line between that and a child that was aborted 50 years ago. It's still the practice. And so I appreciate very much this conversation. I want to know what we do going forward, because it isn't just moral calculus. I mean, the chemist in me, there's a difference between doing entropy calculations and energy calculations when you define the system and the surroundings in your lab bench. You can do that, but it's not realistic, because the surroundings are the rest of the universe. And at some point you have to take your little experiment and you have to put it in the real world. And if you don't take into consideration the surroundings effectively, you'll blow the plant up. So, I mean, I do I do want us to move forward, and I would love to talk to you more, Melissa, because I appreciate most of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a whole lot of good there about how to move forward with the pro-life movement. I
Right.
especially appreciate what you're saying about that. I'm really struggling with how we make a difference, because the use of aborted children in research is getting out of hand. That's another conversation, but I look into this stuff every day, and it's heartbreaking what I read about how aborted children are being used, and the supply and demand at this point already is something we have to take seriously.
Mario and Christopher, we've got now 5 minutes. Please have your thoughts for us.
So my reflection at this point is that aren't we looking for a better society, a better democracy? Are we looking for something that doesn't exist in reality? Are we looking for this, let's say in a term, new Christendom? Because all the time what we are saying is that, well, this company should work better, do better vaccine, but they are not us. It seems that Christians have lost the protagonism of history. And so we are asking others to do what we have failed to do. So all the time we are discussing this as if somebody else is guiding our guiding history. And so, and I have ambivalent view on this, because on the other hand, say, yes, I want a perfect world. I want not vaccine which are not contaminated with this cooperation. But on the other hand, I say, well, I need to be realistic. Why? Because I'm getting old. If I don't get this vaccine, I may die, or my grandma can die. So there is a struggle, a tension about history in itself that it seems that need to be addressed, or at least discussed.
If I could interject, Jim, also, I think in terms of, giving witness, I agree. We absolutely need to be more forceful in giving pro-life witness and in fighting against the many ongoing injustices in research practices and otherwise, right, in terms of the things that Stacy's been talking about. But I think one disanalogy between, the Dorothy Day case that you mentioned, right, where she says, I'm not going to go into the bomb shelter, is, okay, well, Dorothy Day endangered herself by not going into the bomb shelter. She didn't endanger the rest of society. And what's tricky about vaccination is getting vaccinated isn't primarily about protecting your own health. Getting vaccinated is primarily about achieving herd immunity to protect the health of those who are most vulnerable. And so I think the pool of the common good here, which has also been emphasized even more forcefully in the USCCB statement than in the CDF statement, really needs to be taken into account. That vaccination is not a selfish act. In fact, it involves, a slight risk to the people who are relatively healthy in terms of, some side effects and perhaps more. But it's really about thinking about the common good and thinking about, okay, I'm going to get this vaccination so that we as a society can move forward, put an end to these terrible, rates of infections and deaths that have been spiraling, put an end to the many harms of, isolation and job loss and mental health issues and so on that have resulted from this. And so I think that that's really an important thing to consider, is that the common good, very, very important, grave considerations of the common good, weigh in favor of taking the vaccine. And that, even though, yes, I'd much prefer that those vaccines were made with cell lines that were derived in perfectly ethical ways, that's just not an option right now.
But the common good,
Yes.
the common good does it not, can't be built upon the suffering of some, right? We can't build the common good if what we're doing or our practices are actually jeopardizing the lives of others in terms of actual direct injustice. So the question is still before us: do using these cell lines actually indirectly, in a very important way, perpetuate this the act of abortion? If it does, then I think the common good argument doesn't work here, because it is not being realized.
We have 1 minute left, And by executive decision, I oftentimes tell my wife I'm doing something by executive decision, and she
Not
even
right.
more often tells me she's doing something by executive decision. I'm going to extend this by 3 minutes unless people have to flee. I just want to say one thing about Dorothy Day, and then we should end as we always do with our great source of unity, the gospel. When Dorothy was arrested, nobody said to her, "Miss Day, we're doing this because you're risking your life. You're somehow risking your life, and we don't want to see you do that." What they said in effect was, "Dorothy, we got to do this, you see, because what we need is as universal compliance as possible with our civil defense requirements. And if you say that these things are really hollow, well, we disagree. We think they're important. We don't think they're perfect, but we think they're important. And if you say these things are in the end hollow, then, well, other people might follow you." So in fact, the debate on what's going on with Dorothy needs to continue. And the last thing I want to say here is that among scholars, I describe myself as an independent scholar, more independent than scholarly, but among scholars, there's a remarkable new book out by Kevin Flannery on this whole question of cooperation. And he distinguishes between the tradition of the manualists like Alphonsus Liguori and the work of St. Thomas himself. And if anybody's eager to do some digging, it's not too much of a difficulty to dig into Thomas's De Malo, which was brilliantly translated by Gene Osterly of Notre Dame. Well, all right, I've already done my last rant for the day. And now let's get to something that is the real source. This is from today's gospel from Mark. Jesus entered the synagogue. There was a man there who had a withered hand. They watched Jesus closely to see if he would cure him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. He said to the man with the withered hand, "Come up here before us." Then he said to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath rather than to do evil, to save life rather than to destroy it?" But they remained silent. Looking around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart, Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately took counsel with the Herodians against him to put him to death. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you all so very much. One thing about a weekly podcast is it comes up every week, and we're always trying to recruit people just like you. So be careful about emails. They could knock at your door. Thanks, Mario, for setting this
Thank
all
you.
up. All right.
Thank you.
God bless.
Very good.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.